This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Gables, Garridebs, and students all came in 3-packs, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's the difference between a gamekeeper and a gatekeeper? Between a Tregennis and a Tregallis? Between a Jack in office and a Mr. Cocksure?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 259. Did Sherlock Holmes have a sense of humor? Well, hello and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you're a funny guy. Has anyone ever told you that?
Yes. Many people have told me that, usually as they're backing away.
Well, I am here front and center with you, my friend, not going anywhere. And it's a good thing, too, because we have a wonderful show ahead. Show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles259. That's where you can find any necessary links. There is some inspiration behind today's episode, so you can find some of the source material there. Of course, you can also find ways to get in touch with us. You can leave us a comment directly on the show notes there. You can find us at I Hear of Sherlock on all of the social networks. And of course, if you'd like to email us, our email address is trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. We do appreciate your support throughout the year as if you're a patron. We are getting our Patreon gifts ready to go out around the holidays here. So thank you for your patience as we tend to those. And we will continue to operate in that fashion in 2022. So thanks so much. Well, I think it's easy for us to fall under the assumption that Sherlock Holmes, because Watson tells us that logic was opposed to all emotions, that he was not very... Well, that he didn't enjoy humor too much, other than Watson's pawky humor, which kind of annoyed him at times when you think about it. We don't picture Sherlock Holmes as yucking it up with Watson, as being an inveterate joke teller or someone who got great humor out of things. However, we are here today to tell you that that is a false assumption. I was recently on a Reddit thread, and I found a link to this wonderful site called Futility Closet. And there's an entry from December 9th, categorized under literature, and it's titled simply Data. And they note that Sherlock Holmes has the reputation of being relentlessly dour. And in this summation of the data, they cited 2 original sources that really stuck out to us as something worthy of investigation. There was Holmesian Humor by A.G. Cooper in the Sherlock Holmes Journal from the spring of 1964. And there was The Man Who Seldom Laughed from the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual in 1960, written by Charles E. Lauterbach and Edward S. Lauterbach. So we thought that would be... Those sources would provide us of great material to discuss Sherlock Holmes's sense of humor or lack thereof. So, Burt, where shall we begin?
We should begin with poor old Watson, because it's really his fault, as so many things are, that we have this poorly colored, inaccurate view of Sherlock Holmes. And Watson apparently paid so little attention that he could make statements about his friend and colleague that he would then go on almost immediately to contradict in his own other writing. It's just a question. I think Watson may have been hitting the brandy too much. And it starts, obviously, in the earliest appearances of Sherlock Holmes and also the later appearances, the older cases of Sherlock Holmes. In the Mazarin Stone, Watson writes, Holmes seldom laughed.
Now, wait a minute. I want to take issue with that right off the bat before you get to the other reference. The counterpoint to this. Did Watson really write the Mazarin Stone? That's at point here.
Now that's a very good question.
But to your point, though, he did write, and this is a later adventure. He wrote Holmes seldom laughed. But what's the flip side to that?
Well, Holmes laughed all the time. And in fact, Watson would duly note it down. He would write, word, Holmes laughed. I mean, it was... But the fascinating thing is both of these papers in different ways. And the Louderback paper is really a lot of fun, as you've mentioned. Identify it. There's a data table been compiled, a frequency table. And so the Louderbacks tell us that in Watson's own notes, Watson dutifully records Holmes smiling in his 60 recorded adventures 103 times. Then he laughed no less than 65 times, joked 58 times, chuckled 31 times, and there are 59 other times in which he expressed humor, all in Watson's own recorded instances. And yet, says Watson, Holmes seldom laughed.
Well, look, I think we can chalk some of this up to a handicap on Watson's part. You do note the brandy, and alcoholism did run in the Watson family, as we learn in The Sign of Four, when Holmes looked at the watch that Watson inherited with its scratches all over it. He deduced that Watson's brother, who gave the watch to Watson, was a drunk. So this could have been a sensitive area for Watson. We do know that Watson suffered from some physical maladies, injury either in his leg or his shoulder. Again, this has to deal with Watson's forgetfulness. It could have been early onset dementia on his part that was contributing to this. But the Louderbacks, this is where the article for me really starts to sing. It said, in Watson's case, there may have been some excuse. He suffered a handicap, not his leg, which I have no doubt was also the result of the Afghan campaign. Watson was deaf. The proof is obvious and incontrovertible, but it's been completely overlooked by the so-called, quote-unquote, scholars who have trampled like a herd of buffalo over the evidence and have never seen the corpse. And here's an example, and this comes to us from A Study in Scarlet. It was upon the 4th of March, as I have good reason to remember, that I rose somewhat earlier than usual and found that Sherlock Holmes had not yet finished his breakfast. I picked up a magazine from the table and attempted to while away the time with it, while my companion munched silently at his toast. Munched silently at his toast? It's a universally accepted axiom that no human being has ever munched toast silently. It can be done only by dunking, and Holmes had not yet reached the dunking age. Watson just didn't hear it. He reported what he heard, which was nothing. The toast that didn't crunch. This explains so much. And while it does not correct the erroneous dates or clear up the zoological classification of the adder and the speckled band, it does tell us why so many things happened as they did. So, when Watson says Holmes seldom laughed, it's because he couldn't hear him.
Well, I love that explanation. I think that's wonderful. There it was, staring us in the face, the evidence in the toast.
The toast that didn't crunch in the morning time.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Well, the Louderbacks do a wonderful job of chronicling this in this 1960 Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual. Why don't we take a look at the other evidence from across the pond and our friend A.G. Cooper right after this quick break. The Baker Street Journal continues to be the leading Sherlockian publication since its founding in 1946 by Edgar W. Smith. In its pages, you'll find both serious scholarship and articles that play the game. The journal is essential reading for anyone interested in Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and a world where it's always 1895. If you subscribe to the Baker Street Journal, you'll get 4 quarterly issues as well as the Christmas annual. You don't have to be a member of the BSI or of any Sherlockian society for that matter to subscribe to the journal. It's open to anyone who enjoys talking about, reading about, and writing about Sherlock Holmes. And you can also contribute to the BSJ. Your imagination is the only limitation there. So get on the bandwagon and subscribe to the Baker Street Journal this year. Make it an important part of your commitment to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Just go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and subscribe today. You know, I meant to make one point about the Lauterbachs. I looked them up in the list of investitured irregulars. And Charles E. Lauterbach was investitured in 1962 as Thornycroft Huxtable, M.A., Ph.D., etc. And then Edward S. Lauterbach was given the investiture of Thornycroft Huxtable, M.A., Ph.D. in 1965. So 62 and 65, father and son. It turns out that Charles Lauterbach died later that year in 1962, right after his investiture. And Ed Lauterbach, I have his obituary here in the Baker Street Journal from 2009, when he passed away. Ed and his wife, Karen, were co-authors of a number of articles and volumes, including the complete Baker Street Ballads, by Charles E. Lauterbach. So they edited a volume of their father/father-in-law and put it together of all of the humorous poems that he contributed to the Baker Street Journal over the years. And that's available from our friends at Wessex Press, if you'd like to go look that up. They were longtime members of the Illustrious Clients, who just celebrated their 75th anniversary.
Excellent.
Well, why don't you take us across the pond, Bert, to the Sherlock Holmes Journal?
A.G. Cooper, in the spring 1964 Sherlock Holmes Journal, had a lovely paper called Holmesian Humor, which, as you pointed out, is referenced in the great title of that website, The Futility Closet. I just like that a lot. And Cooper had unearthed in his notes, now we just heard about the Lauterbach's researches, but he identified 292 examples of Holmesian humor. Now, his categories are a little different here. Notice he's talking about examples of Holmesian humor, ranging from a faint smile to uncontrolled laughter. And he divided his categories, his researches, the result of his researches, into 2 large groups, basically. Those instances that involved Watson in one way or another and those that didn't. And I like that a lot because Cooper makes the point that one of the greatest sources of amusement that Holmes had was Watson himself. So in The Hound of the Baskervilles, where Holmes is a 221B, Watson has just returned from an outing and is greeted with the remark, "You have been at your club all day, I perceive." And Watson says, "My dear Holmes, am I right?" "Well, certainly, but how?" He laughed at my bewildered expression. Well, Holmes was forever identifying these things. And, Watson apparently was gobsmacked by a lot of it, which caused Holmes lots of opportunities for amusement. And there are plenty of other examples. In Sign of Four, Holmes has just listened to a terrible story told by Mary Morstan and appears to be unmoved. And Watson says, "You really are an automaton, a calculating machine, I cried. There's something positively inhuman in you at times. And Holmes smiled gently at that. He finds Watson very amusing. And then in a case of identity, Watson has just finished giving Holmes his description of a lady who's involved in the case, Mary Sutherland. And Holmes clasped his hands softly together and chuckled, "Oh, upon my soul, Watson, you are coming along wonderfully." And, there are plenty of other instances. Boscombe Valley Mystery. Holmes finds Watson's remarks very amusing. Watson just has finished listening to an outline of a murder case, and Watson says, "Well, I'm afraid the facts are so obvious, Holmes, that you will find little credit to be gained out of this case." And Holmes says, "There's nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact," Holmes answered, laughing. So Watson is forever providing lots of amusement at his own expense to Sherlock Holmes.
He is. And, I think to Watson's credit, it's wonderful that we get these glimpses of Holmes because they are, as you note, at Watson's own expense. He didn't have to put that kind of thing in there. But I think it said just as much about Holmes and Holmes's sense of humor as it does about Watson and Watson's self-effacing sense of humor and his willingness to put that in there.
And Watson was forever misrepresenting, or occasionally, again, misrepresenting Holmes, because in Sussex Vampire, he says, Holmes and Watson are in 221B, and Holmes has read a note that he got in the last post. And then Watson writes down and tells us, then with a dry chuckle, which was his nearest approach to a laugh, he tossed it over to me.
Come on, Watson. Dry chuckle. I mean,
yeah.
So what's a wet chuckle like?
I had a wet chuckle once, but I took it back to the drugstore, and they gave me a fresh package.
Oh, you and your chuckles. I know. I love a good chuckle.
Yeah.
Oh, well, there's lots of different categorizations of Holmes's source or sense of amusement. There's sardonic amusement in, in The Illustrious Client. Sharp to have. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, there's a wonderful, but that's true. But there's a wonderful example, where Holmes is amused by the blunders of the police, and this is from a study of Scarlet. So I don't know how Watson could tell us with a straight face that Holmes seldom laughed, because what happens here is that Holmes and Lestrade are talking about the case, and Lestrade has just made some deductions that are really, a bit off the mark, and Holmes, apparently guffawed at, just couldn't help himself, and then apologizes. He says, "Oh, I really beg your pardon," said my companion, who had ruffled Lestrade's temper by bursting into an explosion of laughter at his remarks.
That's
so apparently
great.
Holmes had this guffaw.
Yeah. And look, later on in the relationship with Lestrade, he was very careful about not doing the same thing. In the Norwood Builder, you recall Lestrade was involved in the Norwood Builder. He pointed out to Holmes the thumbprint on the wall, of course. Now, Holmes already knew that there was no thumbprint there previously. And Watson says, "That is final," I voluntarily echoed. "It is final," said Holmes. Something in his tone caught my ear, and I turned to look at him. An extraordinary change had come over his face. It was writhing with inward merriment. His two eyes were shining like stars. It seemed to me that he was making desperate attempts to restrain a convulsive attack of laughter. Well, look, if Watson knew what a laughing Holmes were like, then he certainly could have identified the restraint of that laughter in this case.
Yeah. Well, Watson always gets these things wrong, apparently. And again, there's a very famous little scene in Hound of the Baskervilles that's really very instructive about this. There's a scene in the Hound of the Baskervilles where Holmes and Watson are looking at a painting on the wall of Baskerville Hall, and Holmes has just discovered this marked resemblance to Hugo Baskerville, the ancestor of Sir Henry. And Watson writes to us, he says, Holmes burst into one of his rare fits of laughter as he turned away from the picture. And this is another interesting description of Holmes's laughter. Watson says, I've not heard him laugh often, and it has always boded ill to somebody.
Well, it depends on the type of laughter, I would imagine. It's wonderful how Cooper ends this article in the Sherlock Holmes Journal with one that he calls the most amusing, and it's from the Sign of Four. Holmes and Watson are following a trail of creosote, of course, with the help of Toby, the dog. And the trail was left by the murderers after many miles of tracking. And in the end, they're confronted not with the murderers or where the murderers ended up, but with a cask of creosote. And Watson writes, with lolling tongue and blinking eyes, Toby stood upon the cask, looking from one to the other of us for some sign of appreciation. Sherlock Holmes and I looked blankly at each other and then burst simultaneously into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. And to me, that's the sign of two great friends who are in the thick of it together and have just traipsed halfway across London, and they can still find humor in something. I mean, that's a testament not only to their friendship, but certainly to each of their senses of humor.
Well, yes, and it's a lovely scene, and it's a very cinematic scene, isn't it? I mean, you just imagine that in your mind. And it's poor old Watson. Apparently all of this went on and made very little impression to him as he thought about Holmes. But it's strange because early on, the very first short story of the case, A Scandal in Bohemia, there's this magnificent scene where Holmes is back in Baker Street in the sort of the middle of the case. And Watson writes to us, he says, putting his hands into his pockets, he stretched out his legs in front of the fire and laughed heartily for some minutes. And apparently Holmes was laughing and laughing and laughing and couldn't get his breath. Holmes says, well, really, he cried, and then he choked and he laughed again until he was obliged to lie back, limp and helpless in the chair. Well, what is it? Oh, Holmes says, it's quite too funny. I'm sure you could never guess how I employed my morning or what I ended by doing. And, of course, Holmes then tells us, about his participation, his disguise as a groom and his participation in Irene Adler's, wedding. But boy, oh boy, if that's not the profile of someone who is not only capable, but frequently enjoys the absurdity and humor of life, I don't know what is.
Indeed. And, when you think about it, I mean, he went on for minutes, Watson said. Minutes. I can't remember having a laughing fit that has lasted minutes. Certainly not in, a room with one other person. Maybe by myself, but then the room was locked and there was rubber on the walls. You would think that by the time we get to the Mazarin Stone, and Watson writes, Holmes seldom laughed, he would have remembered something as non-trifling as Holmes laughing for minutes on end.
Well, sure, but Watson's memory and his ability to recall, now that is a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. Holmes has told me of Brunton's extraordinary gift.